So I was grabbing dinner at Zaxby's the other night, mostly just focused on my chicken fingers,
Right.
In the corner, the TV was playing one of those 24-hour news channels. And there was this older couple at the table next to me, completely locked onto it. The segment was about some, I don't know, local dispute, maybe a school board thing involving a transgender student.
Yeah.
It sounded pretty loud, chaotic.
Yeah, those stories get a lot of airtime.
Definitely. Anyway, the man lets out this really heavy sigh and muttered to his wife, it's an epidemic. They're everywhere.
Wow. Epidemic. That's a strong word.
It really is. And his wife nodded, looking genuinely distressed, saying, you can't escape it. And that word epidemic, it just kind of hung there.
Yeah.
Here we were, in a totally normal fast food place, middle of a normal evening. Nothing around us looked like an epidemic of anything except maybe a craving for Zaxby sauce.
Right. The lived reality versus the screen reality.
Exactly. But for them, this one story amplified on that screen, it had become their entire reality. It sort of replaced what they could see with their own eyes. And it just got me thinking, how does that actually happen? How does a single story, maybe about something incredibly rare, just balloon in our minds until it feels like it's the only story?
That's the core question, isn't it?
Welcome to the deep dive. That anecdote, that feeling that a single rare event has somehow become this overarching crisis, that's precisely the phenomenon we're tackling today. Our mission is really to understand the complex machinery behind this cognitive and social illusion.
Yeah, we're going to dissect what we're calling the anatomy of the amplified threat, because it's a mechanism, right? It relies on these predictable vulnerabilities that, frankly, we all share. We're diving into 3 really powerful interlocking layers that take something small, maybe a rare incident, and just blow it up into a perceived crisis.
So our investigation is going to move pretty logically. First, we'll look inward, at the psychological wiring that primes us to even accept this amplified threat in the first place.
Then we zoom out. We look at the political and media systems that sometimes intentionally exploit that wiring.
Right. And finally, we want to arm you, the listener, with a kind of statistical toolkit. Tools to help recognize the quantitative tricks that are used to manufacture a sense of crisis from data that, often just doesn't support the panic.
It really is a journey. Starts inside our own heads, moves to the, let's call them architects of anxiety, and then lands on this crucial skill of statistical literacy.
Okay, so let's start where that Zaxby's incident really started. Inside the heads of the people watching that news report. When they used that word epidemic, they weren't doing a statistical analysis, right?
No, absolutely not. They were experiencing something powerful, a cognitive shortcut that makes rare, vivid events feel way more common than they are. It's called the availability heuristic.
The availability heuristic. Okay, break that down for us.
Sure. So the availability heuristic, or AVH as researchers sometimes call it, it's fundamental. It's basically a mental shortcut. Instead of, like you said, doing the math, we judge how likely or frequent something is based purely on how easily examples pop into our head.
So if it's easy to remember, we think it happens all the time.
Exactly. Our brain prioritizes efficiency, speed over accuracy. If something is easy to retrieve from memory, maybe because it's really vivid or emotional or shocking, we automatically overestimate how often it occurs.
And this isn't just some harmless mental quirk, is it? It sounds like it has real social consequences.
Oh, huge consequences. When you're constantly bombarded with highly charged emotional extreme stories, could be crime, political drama, health scares, whatever your AVH is just constantly being triggered.
Right, like that couple seeing the news report.
Precisely. And that constant triggering, being in what we call a high AVH environment, it makes people hyper-responsive to extreme opinions. It boosts the influence of authorities or perceived authorities who push those extreme views.
And it fuels polarization.
Dramatically. It promotes opinion polarization because the most extreme narratives are often the simplest, the most vivid, the easiest to remember. They stick. And what sticks in your mind feels like the truth, feels like it's common.
Okay, so that tendency to favor what's easily recalled, it sounds like it meshes perfectly with another cognitive trap, confirmation bias.
It absolutely does. They work hand in glove. Confirmation bias is this tendency where we don't just passively absorb information. We actively seek out, interpret, and crucially remember information that confirms what we already believe, or even more powerfully, what we already fear.
We look for evidence that proves us right.
Essentially, yes. And this is where the systems delivering information, especially social media platforms, become really critical. They're not neutral pipes.
You mean the algorithms?
Exactly. We talk about echo chambers, but it's deeper. The algorithm algorithms aren't just grouping people who think alike, they are actively reinforcing your confirmation bias. They feed you homogeneous, one-sided opinions, specifically tailored to keep you engaged, keep you scrolling.
It sounds like a feedback loop. You click on something scary, the algorithm shows you more scary stuff like it.
That's precisely it. It's a self-sustaining loop. If you engage with content suggesting, say, a new policy is a terrifying threat, the algorithm sees that engagement, that click, that share, that angry comment as proof of your worldview. So it immediately injects more similar content into your feed.
And the long-term effect is, well, it sounds pretty bad.
It drives systemic polarization. Because if Group A is only ever seeing evidence confirming their belief, and Group B is only ever seeing evidence confirming the opposite belief, the system sustains these completely separate realities long term. Both groups become utterly convinced that their amplified one-sided view is the dominant reality, even if the actual statistics, the global norm, says something totally different.
So our brains are primed for easy emotional stories. The algorithms feed us stories consuming our fears. What's the emotional engine driving all this? It sounds like fear itself is key.
Fear is the ultimate accelerant. Yes. Think about the pandemic. Fear, whether it was fear of COVID itself or fear of the vaccine's side effects, it made people listen much more closely to whoever they considered an authority.
But that could be different authorities for different people, right?
Exactly. It created this dual dynamic. Some people, fearing the disease, sought out traditional public health guidance. Others, fearing institutions or the treatment itself, sought out alternative voices, often on social media, both driven by fear, but leading to opposite conclusions.
The whole COVID vaccination debate felt like a really stark example of this polarization in risk perception.
It was a fascinating, if worrying, case study. When researchers looked at how people perceived vaccine risk, they didn't find a smooth curve like you might expect. They found a bimodal distribution.
Meaning people clumped at the extremes.
Precisely. People clustered either at the high-risk perception end or the low-risk perception end. That middle ground, the sort of statistically grounded, nuanced assessment, it was almost entirely absent from the public conversation.
And people's perceptions were way off from the actual data.
Staggeringly so. There was that Gallup survey. I think it found something like 92% of respondents significantly overstated the risk of hospitalization for unvaccinated people.
92%, wow.
Yeah. And even for the vaccinated, 62% still overstated the risk. It just shows how perceived reality, fueled by this polarization and fear, completely swamped the statistical reality. The actual numbers became almost secondary to the narrative that fit your group's identity.
That study really hits home. But it also raises a tough ethical question, doesn't it? Because sometimes authorities intentionally use fear, right, as a communication tactic.
That's a really complex and sensitive area. Historically, yes. Communication campaigns designed specifically to create fear, sometimes drawing on research from past pandemics like influenza. They were used to encourage public obedience or compliance with health measures.
How does that work?
The idea is basically to highlight the grave danger of the threat, make it feel very immediate and scary, and then simultaneously promote the required action like getting a vaccine or following lockdown rules as the only way to reduce that fear and regain safety.
But that sounds manipulative. Have people involved acknowledged that?
Some have, yes. There's been reflection. Some scientific advisors involved in crafting those kinds of strategies have later expressed pretty deep regret. They've used words like unethical or even totalitarian to describe using psychological manipulation, even if the goal was public health.
So there's a real tension there. Where's the line between informing people of risks and just, well, scaring them into compliance?
That's the fundamental ethical dilemma. Even if the aim is the public good, is leveraging primal fear to bypass rational thought a sustainable or ethical way to manage behavior. And the big risk is, the moment those tactics get exposed or even perceived, they fuel the counter-narrative, deepen the polarization, and create lasting suspicion towards all official authority. It can backfire badly.
Okay, this is getting even more complicated. Because our decisions aren't just about personal fear or confirmation bias, are they? Our social circles matter. A lot.
Hugely. We often assume big decisions, health, finance, politics, are purely rational, based on facts and personal assessment. But research using frameworks like HUMAT suggests something quite different.
HUMAT? What's that?
It stands for Human Agent-Based Modeling Framework. It's basically a way to simulate how behaviors spread through social networks by incorporating various drivers, cognitive, emotional, and crucially, social.
And what does it show?
What it consistently formalizes and demonstrates is the surprising primacy of social needs when it comes to adopting behaviors. Things like getting vaccinated or even adopting a certain political stance. These social needs often have the biggest impact, frequently outweighing things we'd think are primary, like personal safety or economic sense.
So my brain might tell me getting the shot is logical based on risk assessment, but if my friends are all against it.
Your social needs might pull you in the opposite direction.
Exactly. The key driver often isn't the global norm, what the overall majority thinks or does, but the perceived local norm. What your immediate network, your ego network friends, family, trusted online groups believes and does.
And if my view clashes with my group's view,
then you experience dissonance. There's a tension between your personal preference, what you think is right, and social acceptance within your local group. And you try to resolve that tension through information exchange.
how? By arguing my case or asking for advice?
Both. You might engage in signaling, trying to convince your network to adopt your view. Or you might engage in inquiring, asking persuasive people in your network for their advice, which often leads you to adopt their view to maintain harmony.
So fitting in can trump facts. In many cases, yes. If your local network is really unified and strongly against a particular behavior, the social cost of going against the grain can easily feel higher than the perceived personal benefit of the behavior itself. This can lock you into a minority viewpoint that, to you, feels like the absolute majority because everyone you trust agrees.
Okay, so if our minds are basically pre-wired to grab onto anecdotes, seek out confirming evidence, and conform to our local group, especially when we're scared, well, that sounds like a perfect setup for manipulation.
It absolutely creates fertile ground. And that leads us directly to the political mechanism specifically designed to exploit these vulnerabilities. The moral panic.
Moral panic, that term gets thrown around. What does it mean in a, sociological sense?
Moral panic is basically a widespread feeling of fear, often disproportionate, sometimes artificially generated, that some perceived evil, maybe a person, a group, an idea, even a thing, threatens the core values, interests, or well-being of society. It's incredibly effective because it taps directly into that primal fear we were just talking about.
And the key thing, going back to the Zaxby's example, is exaggeration, right? The threat might be sort of real, but the panic blows it way out of proportion.
That's the crucial distinction. The identified issue, maybe it's a genuine policy disagreement or a shift in social norms that might exist, but the claims made by the people driving the panic massively exaggerate the seriousness or how widespread it is or how typical it is or the idea that the negative outcome is inevitable. It's primarily a problem of amplification, sometimes even more than outright invention.
How does a moral panic actually unfold? Is there a pattern?
There often is. Sociologists like Stanley Cohen developed models to map this out. It usually starts with what he called moral entrepreneurs.
Who are they?
These are the individuals or groups who kickstart the panic. Often politicians, maybe religious leaders, media editors, sometimes even specific experts. They perceive something as a threat to certain social values, frequently conservative or traditional values, and they actively work to convince the broader public about the danger and the urgency.
And they need a target, right? Someone to blame.
Yes, that's the folk devil. This is the group or the type of person that gets defined as the source of the threat, the embodiment of the evil. Historically, think mods and rockers in 1960s Britain or various immigrant groups throughout history. Today, you often see LGBTQ plus people or feminists or other groups challenging traditional power structures cast in this role.
So the moral entrepreneurs identify a folk devil. What happens next?
Typically, the media plays a huge role. They often exaggerate and distort the initial event or issue using simplistic, high-emotion language. This stokes public anxiety. Then the gatekeepers, police, courts, lawmakers feel pressured to respond. This leads to new policies, new laws, crackdowns. And finally, the condition either sort of fades away as attention shifts, or, and this happens often, it becomes permanently baked into policy and public discourse. Think about the Red Scare or the ongoing anxiety around terrorism.
It sounds like there's a pretty cynical calculation behind this. It's less about actual morality and more about power.
That's often the underlying driver, yes. Many analyses suggest moral panics are frequently less about safeguarding genuine morals and far more about securing or maintaining power.
How so?
They can be incredibly useful tools. They can be used to secure existing privileges, especially for dominant groups. They can stifle social or economic changes that threaten the status quo. They can be used to fight democratic reforms that might empower marginalized groups. And very effectively, they redirect public anger or economic anxiety away from systemic issues and towards an easily identifiable scapegoat.
So if people are worried about jobs, you give them a cultural enemy instead.
That's a classic tactic. And it's powerful for building unusual alliances, what we might call coalition building. If you can successfully frame something progressive, say, gender equality or new educational curricula as an existential threat to the family or our way of life, you can rapidly bring together groups that might not normally agree on much else.
Like religious conservatives and certain political factions.
Exactly. They unite around this shared goal of defending perceived traditional values against this amplified common enemy.
This connects back to the idea of availability entrepreneurs you mentioned. People actively crafting these narratives.
Yes. In the modern culture wars, we see these actors who aren't just reporting on existing issues. They are sometimes deliberately inventing or at least traumatically sensationalizing rare social problems that crucially lack solid statistical backing. They fill the data vacuum with high availability, high impact anecdotes.
Can you give an example? You mentioned one from the 90s.
Right. The concept of regret rape. This was a narrative pushed in some circles back in the 1990s.
What was the claim?
The claim, or insinuation, was that women were increasingly faking rape allegations after consensual sex simply because they regretted the encounter later. The political goal seemed pretty clear: to undermine trust in assault victims generally, and thus weaken the social and legal structures designed to protect them.
By making people doubt accusations.
Precisely. The strategy wasn't based on robust data showing a rise in false allegations. Instead, the narrative itself was repeated so often, amplified through certain media, that it started to feel true. It boosted the availability heuristic for the rare event of a false accusation, leading some people to believe the rate was maybe closer to 40% when the actual statistically supported evidence puts it around 1–2%. They manufactured a crisis of false accusations through sheer repetition.
And you see this same playbook today?
Absolutely. You see the exact same mechanics deployed heavily around the idea of a transgenderism epidemic.
How does that work in this context?
The mechanism is identical. Availability entrepreneurs, certain politicians, influencers, media outlets, they sensationalize the phenomenon by relentlessly sharing vivid emotional anecdotes. You hear the story, perhaps fictionalized or distorted, about the teenager who suddenly insists on a new name and pronouns after seeing something online.
That one story gets amplified over and over.
Exactly. That single, often decontextualized story is pushed out constantly. What gets carefully, deliberately omitted is the actual conclusion from medical and social research. Things like gender-affirming surgeries for minors are statistically extremely rare. Depending on the age group and specific procedure, virtually non-existent in many cases.
But the anecdote replaces the data.
Yes. By leaving out the objective statistical rarity and just hammering the shocking anecdote, they replace a needed, measured discussion with this pervasive sense of crisis. And that perceived crisis then becomes the justification for sweeping policy actions, banning certain medical care, restricting educational content, and so on.
And you mentioned this isn't just a U.S. thing.
No, it's strikingly transnational. These crusades against so-called gender ideology are visible across the globe. Poland, Hungary, parts of Latin America, fueled by similar narratives, often amplified by international networks and media like Fox News in the U.S. The global playbook often involves linking progressive ideas about gender, anything challenging rigid, traditional roles, to foreign, dangerous, existential threats.
Like comparing it to communism or Nazism.
Exactly. In the Polish context, for instance, gender studies might be framed as a dangerous import akin to Nazism or communism. The ultimate goal seems consistent: mobilize a perceived moral majority against corrupt elites or dangerous outsiders in order to consolidate political power and reassert deeply conservative, often patriarchal social control. All of it justified by an amplified threat that, statistically speaking, is marginal.
Okay, so we've got the psychology, our brains are susceptible, we've got the politics, people intentionally creating moral panics.
Yeah.
Now, the final piece, the numbers themselves. Because even if you suspect manipulation, seeing a statistic, especially on a chart, feels convincing.
That implicit trust is the final vulnerability we really need to address. Statistics are absolutely essential for any kind of informed public conversation, right? But their misuse, whether it's deliberate manipulation or just a lack of crucial context or even honest misinterpretation, it always distorts the truth. And critically, it reinforces those cognitive biases and political narratives we've been discussing.
So if we're trying to build like a personal statistical toolkit to defend against this, what's the number one lesson, the most fundamental thing?
It has to be the absolute necessity of contextualized data. And practically speaking, that usually means developing a strong preference for rates and proportions over raw absolute numbers. You almost always need to compare rates to get meaningful context.
Can you illustrate that? You mentioned a murder rate example earlier.
Right, the classic example. Let's imagine two cities. City A reports 500 murders last year. City B reports 100 murders.
Okay, based on just those raw numbers, City B sounds way safer, like 5 times safer.
Seems obvious, right? But now add the crucial context. Population. Let's say City A has a population of 3 million people. City B, however, only has 300,000 people.
Ah, okay, so we need to calculate the rate.
Exactly. Let's look at the rate per 100,000 residents, a standard measure. For City A, 500 murders divided by 3 million people times 100,000. That gives you a rate of about 16.7 murders per 100,000 people.
Okay, 16.7. Now City B...
For City B, 100 murders divided by 300,000 people times 100,000. That gives you a rate of 33.3 murders per 100,000 people.
Wow, okay, so City B, the one with far fewer murders in raw numbers, actually has double the murder rate of City A.
That's the power of context. Just reporting the raw number 500 murders in City A creates alarm, maybe fuels a narrative about urban decay, while the much higher risk in City B gets completely missed. Omitting population size lets raw numbers artificially inflate or deflate the perception of severity, driving anxiety or complacency.
Okay, that's fundamental. Let's dig into some specific tactics used to deceive with numbers. What's a really common one?
Probably the most pervasive and frankly dishonest is cherry-picking data.
Picking only the numbers that fit your story.
Precisely. It involves selecting only the specific data points or time periods or subgroups that support your predetermined message, while consciously ignoring all the contradictory information, even if it's the vast majority of the data.
It's like a company only highlighting its best sales quarter.
Or a political group wanting to claim the economy is fantastic. They might highlight job growth in one specific sector or one specific month, while ignoring stagnant wages, rising long-term unemployment, or struggles in other sectors. They paint a partial picture that supports their narrative. And because it's amplified, it becomes the easily available truth in people's minds.
The manipulation isn't always buried in spreadsheets, though. Sometimes it's visual, right? In graphs and charts.
Oh, absolutely. Misleading visuals are incredibly common and effective. Graphs feel objective, but they're so easy to manipulate.
What's the most common trick with graphs?
Manipulating the y-axis, the vertical one. Especially truncating the scale. This means instead of starting the axis at 0, they start at much higher, say at 50%, or maybe just below the lowest data point.
Why do that?
Because it makes tiny, insignificant changes look like huge, dramatic shifts. A small uptick that's barely noticeable on a 0-100 scale can look like a mountain peak if the scale only runs from, say, 80 to 85. Your brain registers the steep line, the dramatic shape, and often ignores the actual numbers on the axis. You're visually convinced a 2% change is a 50% change.
You see that constantly in advertising comparing products. Always check the axis baseline.
Always. Another visual trick is selective data presentation. Maybe a company chart conveniently leaves out the years their product performed poorly, making a rival look worse by comparison.
Okay, another big one we hear about is correlation versus causation.
The classic fallacy. This is a real workhorse in misleading arguments, especially political ones. It's where you show that two things happen together, correlation, and imply or state outright that one caused the other without any actual proof of causality.
We know the mantra. Correlation doesn't imply causation. But it still trips people up, especially with charged topics.
It really does. Take a hypothetical report linking living near a certain factory, factor A, with higher rates of a specific illness, factor B. A statistical correlation might exist. People near the factory do get sick more often.
So the factory caused it.
Not necessarily. The real cause, the confounding factor, factor C, might be poverty. Maybe property values near the factory are low, so the residents are disproportionately lower income. Lower income is often correlated with higher stress, poorer diet, less access to healthcare, all of which could be the actual drivers of the illness. The factory A and the illness B are correlated only because both are linked to the third factor, poverty C. But the activist or politician can just wave the correlation study and say, see, the factor is making people sick, bypassing the need for actual proof.
Okay, let's touch on some slightly more advanced fallacies that can creep into reports that sound very official or scientific. What about data dredging?
Right. Data dredging, sometimes called p-hacking or data phishing. This is basically the abuse of data mining. It's when someone takes a huge data set with tons of variables and just runs test after test after test, looking for any statistically significant correlation after the fact without having a specific hypothesis beforehand.
Like throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks.
Kind of, yeah. The problem isn't exploring data to generate ideas. That's fine. The misuse comes when you find that one correlation out of hundreds you tested, which probably occurred just by random chance, and then present that specific finding as meaningful proof of something without confirming it independently.
So a drug company tests a new drug against 50 different conditions and finds it only seems to work for one very specific rare side effect in men over 60.
And then they might try to market it based only on that potentially random finding, ignoring the 49 failures. It's using data mining to find support for a desired outcome, not to find truth.
Okay, another subtle one. The proof of the null hypothesis fallacy.
This one sounds technical, but the error is common. It's assuming that because a study failed to disprove something, it failed to reject the null hypothesis. That thing must therefore be true.
Example.
Imagine a study designed to see if a new chemical is dangerous. But maybe the study is poorly designed. Maybe the sample size is way too small, so it lacks statistical power. The study concludes it cannot prove the chemical is dangerous.
So it's safe.
That's the fallacy. The company making the chemical might claim, see, the study proved it's safe. No, it didn't. All the study proved was that this specific, possibly weak study didn't find sufficient evidence of harm. A failure to prove harm is absolutely not the same as proof of safety.
Right. And finally, the difference between statistical significance and practical significance.
This is so important, especially when you see claims about new products or policy successes. Statistical significance just tells you that a result is unlikely to be due to random chance. It's probably a real effect.
But is it a meaningful effect?
That's practical significance. Does the result actually matter in the real world? A huge study on a new fertilizer might find a statistically significant result. It makes crops grow 0.001% taller. The result is real, not random chance. But is it practically significant? Will a farmer care about that tiny difference? Absolutely not.
Like the classic example of a baldness cure that's statistically proven to work, but all it grows is like barely visible peach fuzz.
Exactly. It's a statistically significant result with negligible practical significance. Yet that result might be trumpeted in headlines or used to justify funding, misleading people about the actual real-world benefit.
When you add all these statistical tricks up, the cost isn't just buying a useless product. It has much bigger impacts, doesn't it?
Massive impacts. We're talking about serious policy mistakes because resources get misallocated based on faulty data or manufactured panic. We see reputations damaged, huge financial losses for individuals and society. And perhaps most relevant to our discussion today, the constant reinforcement of harmful biases and stereotypes. When distorted crime statistics are weaponized, they contribute directly to systemic bias and discrimination. When data is twisted to create panic, it fundamentally undermines informed public discourse and replaces it with politically useful, but ultimately destructive anxiety. #outro.
So when we loop all the way back to that couple in Zaxby's, hearing that word epidemic, it becomes much clearer, doesn't it? That perceived crisis, that feeling that something rare has ballooned until it feels like it's everywhere. It's almost never a simple reflection of statistical reality.
No, it's far more likely to be a highly engineered construct. It's really a potent synthesis of those three distinct forces we've walked through.
First, it leverages our own minds against us, right? Those inherent cognitive shortcuts, the availability heuristic making vivid anecdotes feel common, confirmation bias making us seek out evidence for our fears.
Exactly. That creates the fertile ground. Then second, that psychological wiring gets intentionally exploited by political actors, the moral entrepreneurs, using that well-worn moral panic playbook. They exaggerate marginal issues, they scapegoat folk devils, all to rapidly build coalitions and consolidate power.
And finally, that whole political project gets wrapped into veneer of legitimacy through statistical manipulation. The cherry-picking, the misleading charts, the confusion of correlation and causation, it all serves to validate the panic and make it feel data-driven, even when it's not.
It's a deep, interconnected feedback loop. Psychology primes us, politics exploits us, and manipulated data seals the deal, transforming a minor concern into this pervasive, amplified threat that serves a specific political purpose.
And we can't forget that social layer either. Even if you know the statistics, even if you see the manipulation, the pressure to conform to your local group, online or offline, can be incredibly powerful, sometimes overriding even accurate knowledge.
That social need for belonging is a profound force, often underestimated in how it shapes our acceptance of these amplified narratives.
So, navigating this modern information landscape, the real challenge, it seems, isn't just about spotting fake news or knowing which numbers are technically true. It's about recognizing that the political world often plays by different rules than the world of objective analysis.
There's a constant tension. Because good government, sound policy, it really requires accurate numbers, careful context. But popular government, the kind that often wins elections by tapping into primal fears and group identities, frequently just needs numbers and stories that are supportive of a desired narrative that create that high availability anxiety.
The real danger, then, isn't necessarily the rare event itself, whether it's a specific crime or a social change. It's the sophisticated, multi-layered mechanism, psychological, political, and statistical, that's deliberately designed to hijack our attention, amplify our anxieties, and ultimately replace our own observed reality with a more dramatic, more frightening, and ultimately more politically useful version of the world.